to de Gaulle, which is an interesting guy to come up in this hearing, de Gaulle would never, ever have prevailed, no matter how much support he had from the French people, had U.S. troops not been involved in the equation. Never.
Absolutely.
I mean, the Vichy government had been installed by a regime or by a military action taken by a government that believed in the will, the triumph of the will. And we have to note that when you have forces in this world that will triumph because they have the will to triumph, like radical Islam believes they have the will to triumph over the decadent West, or like communism felt they had the will to triumph over the decadent democracies and the decadent West. And the question is whether or not the United States should, in various countries around the world, be a force that prevents that triumph of the will of anti-democratic forces. And to what degree, and is indeed what we are doing going to eventually lead in Iraq to a more Western or more freer, more open society. I think certainly there's no doubt about it, more open than the radical Islamic alternative. Certainly that's true. So the criticisms, I think, are justified in the sense that it's truth. Truth is important. Whether or not how we make the decision as to what our strategic commitment will be cannot be based on the imperfections of the people involved at that moment. I will, however, be opposed to the idea that the United States, in order to make a commitment for more than a 90-day military commitment, needs to declare war in order to do so. However, I would say they certainly needs some type of congressional approval and involvement. But
just a couple of really short questions first. Dr. Macgregor, were you saying in the very beginning in your testimony that we only have status of forces agreements pursuant to treaty obligations?
No, what I was
I mean, you made a reference to Germany and Japan, and I wasn't sure what the implication of that was.
No, we have status of forces agreements where there is no mutual defense treaty in existence. My concern was that the level of commitment that we're talking about in Iraq is on a scale commensurate with what we've done in Germany and Korea. And in those cases where there were serious external threats to the German and Korean peoples, we negotiated status of forces agreements within the framework of mutual defense treaties. Now, what we're being told in the Declaration of Joint Principles is that we're going to defend Iraq from external and internal enemies. The interesting thing about that is that there are no Islamist fascist armies mobilizing on the border of Iraq prepared to invade. In other words, there is no enemy army in Iran or Syria or Saudi Arabia or Jordan or the Emirates preparing to intervene in Iraq. The only army in the region, by the way, that has the capacity to project power over its borders any distance at all is the Turkish army. And it has made it abundantly clear that its interests are limited exclusively to the elimination of the Kurdish terrorist threat to the Turkish state. The issue for me is this notion that there should be an open-ended pledge on the part of the American people to defend a government in Baghdad that, in my view, is not legitimate and would not survive the withdrawal of U.S. military power. It is something that is not consistent with the way we have done business in the past. It's not consistent with our values. All right. That's my concern.
I would like to get an answer on with your view that we put aside the declaration.
Well, I agree. Yeah.
And I really would like to get an answer from you, and quickly, whether you think that's what our course of action should be, and anyone start wherever they'd like.
Well, first of all, I recommended in the statement that I submitted to the record that under no circumstances should the United States Congress, Senate, and the House support this joint declaration of principles. It's for all of the legal reasons that you've heard, but it's a very potentially dangerous document that commits us to all sorts of courses of actions that the American people would not normally ever undertake. I want to make the point that if you look carefully at this joint declaration, setting aside the economic provisions, and those are very disturbing because those are really reminiscent of what the British Empire tried to do in Iraq after World War I. And I'm certainly in favor of advancing the interests of American business. That's not the issue. But we're dealing with a very weak state right now, if you even want to dignify it with that word. And that's disturbing. But the real issue for me is that the focus of this agreement is not really on an external threat of any kind, which has traditionally been our position. It's on propping up, supporting, defending, however you want to characterize it, this government in Iraq that has serious problems. So many problems that one wonders why one would sign any agreement under these circumstances with the current government. And then there's an undercurrent here that I think deserves some attention, because Mr. Rohrabacher was very articulate in the way he presented the political rationale that the White House uses. The comparisons are always back to World War II, specifically Germany and Japan, and subsequently to Korea. We need to understand that the conditions in that period of time that produced the outcomes that we saw in those countries have nothing to do with conditions today in Iraq. It's very important to understand that. We stayed in Germany because there were 15 million Soviet troops poised to march to Paris. That's why we stayed in Germany. And the Germans, by the way, were very happy to have us, because the alternative to us was the Red Army, a very unattractive alternative indeed. The situation was not very different in Japan. Manchuria and Korea were rapidly overrun by the Soviets and their communist allies, and it looked very grim indeed that Japan might also end up being part of the communist orbit. We had to stay there. The Korean War, the alternative to Americans remaining and negotiating a settlement with the Chinese was that the entire peninsula would become communist. And the people that lived in the south end of the peninsula did not want to live under a communist regime. By the way, the government at the time that we were defending, Syngman Rhee, was not democratic at all. In fact, it was so undemocratic at the time that the State Department wanted MacArthur to hold elections and have Syngman Rhee removed. And he pointed out that was absolutely unachievable. And he said the most important thing is that he is legitimate in the eyes of the Korean people, and he is Korean, and Koreans must rule Koreans, not Americans. Now, the chairman has talked about the series of mistakes that we have made, and they have been egregious. One of those mistakes from the outset has been to characterize any Muslim Arab in Iraq who shoots at us as an al-Qaeda terrorist, when we have generals like Abu Zaid on record in testimony who tell us that al-Qaeda has never represented more than 3 to 5% of the opposition to us inside Iraq. And we know that al-Qaeda was not in the country in any strength or any significance until we arrived. And we know that the population, Shiite and Sunni, is really not interested in having them in the country. So the question that we ought to ask is, whom have we been killing, wounding, and incarcerating for 5 years in Iraq? Are these not simply people who would like us to leave? And I think that's the other aspect that you've pointed to. It's what the chairman has said. What about the so-called will of the Iraqi people? Specifically, we're talking about the Arabs of central and southern Iraq. We don't really know what that is, but we can say with relative certainty that they would like us to leave, that they do not want a permanent U.S. military presence in that country. And by the way, they are joined by hundreds of millions of other Muslim Arabs who oppose any permanent U.S. or foreign military presence on their soil. We need to take those kinds of concerns into consideration. So the bottom line is, this joint declaration is a very dangerous document. It commits the American people, the United States Congress, to courses of action that I think are illegitimate and are courses of action that you as a body would normally never take. So it absolutely should be rejected.
Well, it's good to have a very healthy discourse, and it was extremely informative. We're not going to keep you here any longer, but this was a very worthwhile. Your obvious experience and talent and insights are extremely valuable, and we'll continue to call you as resources for our own deliberations. And with that, we'll adjourn. Thank you.